So the EPBC Act has been in Acts for 25 years now. It started under the Howard era, introduced by Robert Hill, and it went through its first review in 2010 and its second review by Professor Graham Samuel in 2020. And it was that second review that we're dealing with the response from the government right now. As I mentioned, the 1,500 pages of legislation currently before Parliament. And what the government is proposing to do is a broad suite of reforms that respond to elements of the Samuel Review, introducing things like national environmental standards, looking to ways to streamline approvals and decision making. But importantly, there are some significant concerns and issues that we've identified in the design of that legislation and the reforms themselves. So today we'll be hearing from a range of experts on those reforms and what's before Parliament. I'd like to start with introducing Dr. Tegan Shields, a research fellow at Curtin University, who is a proud Arabana woman who has worked in strategic policy reform, community engagement and biodiversity conservation for the past 15 years. Tegan is a lead counsellor at the Biodiversity Council and believes the answer to conservation issues facing Australia lies in Indigenous-led use of traditional knowledge. So throwing to you, Tegan.
Thanks, James. Hello to everyone. Quite a few of you on the chat. Good to see so many coming in from Wajak Budja, which is where I'm also based. Very honoured to kind of sit in this space and live on Wajak Budja. It's a beautiful place in the world. So EPBC Act stuff. James gave a bit of an overview about how long this has been going on, and the reform process in itself feels like it's been going on for a lifetime. More recently, we've seen a lot of key Aboriginal organisations make some statements around the lack of engagement that they've experienced throughout that process, which, has been going on for some 5 years, raising real concerns around the climate trigger and the water triggers within that piece of legislation. And I know others within this webinar will touch on that later on. But importantly, Indigenous groups are raising concerns around how can they be sitting at the table and have improved decision making in these processes, particularly when we think about approvals and assessments for sites. At this point in time, a lot of that stuff isn't clear because the national environmental standards have not all been released, particularly the First Nations engagement and participation standards. So we really are sort of unsure around what that will look like and whether we'll actually start to see that shift for Indigenous groups into a rights holder's place. And also, the other bit of the puzzle that's missing is around what will the EPA's function be and how will it interact with those standards, and what that will look like will really inform a lot of those concerns that Indigenous groups are raising today. Not surprisingly, over the course of this EPBC Act reform process, Aboriginal groups are pushing for improved governance across the legislation, with key ideas like a Commissioner for Country or Voice for Country, a statutory position that sits either within the EPBC Act or the EPA to actually really govern and improve the consideration of cultural values in that decision-making process. We've seen so far that the government hasn't really picked up on those reforms yet, and so we're still watching to see in terms of what happens there. But I think a lot of Indigenous groups are seeing that there's still opportunity for improvement. The other things are really, reflecting meaningful Indigenous values within the reform process. And so there has been a lot of groups championing things like including Indigenous protected areas as a matter of national environmental significance, and also culturally significant entities as a matter of national environmental significance, really advocating for there to be change, on-ground change for how Indigenous groups manage country and empowered to be at that decision-making table and seeing their values protected under this piece of legislation. I think, again, importantly, when we look to those national environmental standards, we really need to see Indigenous knowledge embedded across those. And so how we do that with the ones that have been released, like the M&ES and the offsets, needs some consideration, because at the moment it's void, and so really seeing how those standards play out in this reform process will really be important. And the other thing I think that groups are really pushing for that we've not seen in this ledge that's been tabled is the increase of Indigenous representation on statutory committees. So you'll see that there's a couple of new references to statutory committees, but we haven't had any improvement on the mandate of Indigenous representation on things like the Threatened Species Scientific Committee and others. And so really trying to advocate for Indigenous experts to be sitting at the table where those decisions are making. I think too, positively there has been some meaningful inclusions in this piece of legislation, particularly around the Environmental Information Australia. We've seen Indigenous authors be included in the SOE reporting, and that to be a mandated path going forward with that 2-year reporting. So I think that that's a really positive step change. Also how the EPA through the EIA will consider Indigenous data in decision-making process. There again kind of comes back to that the data standard under the National Environmental Standards and how that operates, and how Indigenous data will be considered by the decision maker is still yet to be determined. And I think the other positive kind of reflections for the EPBC Act reform is that we're seeing improved mandate for the Indigenous Advisory Committee, the statutory committee that sits under that, with clear links to the Threatened Species Scientific Committee and their processes, but also to the Director of National Parks, and a clear link to the CEO of the EPA. So I think that there are some promising things in there, but we're also really waiting for that detail that comes out. I'm going to leave it there because I know we've got a very full agenda, and hand back to James.
Thanks, Tegan. And I think, there are definitely some positive signs in there, but there's definitely a lot more work that needs to be done, as you've alluded to. Professor Jan McDonald is on the call from the University of Tasmania. Jan is a professor of environment and climate law, has taught and researched environment and climate law for over 3 decades, and her current research examines how the law can promote adaptation to the impacts of climate change and the responsible use of climate intervention technologies. So, Jan, I'll throw to you to kind of talk to your key points, and I think you've got some slides as well for us.
Thanks, James. Yes, I've just got one slide. I'm joining you from Nipaluna, Hobart today, and I extend my gratitude and deep respect to the Palawa Pakana elders, past and present, here in Lutruwita and across the country. I'm going to talk about this fundamental proposition that the reforms that we see in the EPBC Act really have to constrain and not expand the ministerial discretion that we already have under the Act. I'm not assuming anybody knows anything about the EPBC Act, so if you feel like I'm telling you how to suck eggs, please, I'm starting from ground zero with a tiny bit of background. The EPBC Act review made several key criticisms of the current operation of the Act, and one of those was that too many of the critical decisions under the Act were left to ministerial discretion without any real guidance on how the minister should exercise that discretion. And it meant that approvals could be granted, other key determinations would be made, decisions about whether an approval was even needed could be made provided the minister was just satisfied that requirements were met. The current reform package continues this subjective test so that many of the core decisions, whether actions are consistent with the new national environmental standards, whether they constitute environmental impacts, decisions on whether to make rulings, all of those things are left to the minister being satisfied. The concern is that this creates uncertainty, it creates inconsistency, it leaves decisions to the mercy of political imperatives. And as we've seen through EPBC Act litigation over the last 20 or so years, it makes it extremely difficult to hold decision makers to account. Only if a decision is completely unjustified or manifestly unreasonable on the evidence will a court ever second guess the minister's exercise of discretion. So the current bills really need to be strengthened to ensure that these key decision points clarify what the criteria are and make those criteria objective, accountable tests, preferably specified either in the legislation itself or in national environmental standards. And that takes me to the next point, which is the proposal to include these national environmental standards. So a corollary of the review's criticism that the Act gave the Minister too much discretion was that it lacked any objective standards against which that discretion could be judged. So it proposed the development of binding national environmental standards for a whole range of issues, benchmarks for the levels of protection for matters of national environmental significance, biodiversity offsets, First Peoples engagement, and a range of other issues. And it's really pleasing to see that this recommendation has been incorporated and reflected in the reform proposals, and particularly pleasing to see that once these standards have actually been introduced, they are going to be subject to a non-regression principle, which means that subsequent amendments can't dilute them either procedurally or in their substance. So that's really fantastic. The problem is that their current form really requires strengthening if these national environmental standards are going to deliver on the key recommendations of the review. At present, the bills don't specify which standards, or indeed if any standards, have to be developed. Only 2 draft standards are going to be accompanying the reform package, one relating to matters of national environmental significance and one relating to offsets, but there's no guarantee of binding standards being introduced for any of the other matters. The current proposals also don't actually specify which decisions under the Act have to follow these national environmental standards. They only say that the government can make a regulation that stipulates which decisions will apply to or be subject to which standards. So to really ensure that the national environmental standards work to properly guide and constrain decision making, the reforms need to specify that standards have to be made on certain topics. They need to make those standards mandatory for all relevant decisions, either in the legislation itself, rather than in subsequent regulation that can be altered much more easily. And this is really important because at the moment, what we're seeing is that the reforms propose to retain the carve-out of special protections or exemptions for industries, particularly forestry operations. So at the moment, those national environmental standards don't apply to anything, but they definitely don't apply to this really critical activity that we know has harmful effects. And so on the one hand, we've retained a very clear protection or carve out for forestry, and yet the protections that are being built up aren't really providing the same level of benefit that we really need to see. Another key way in which the reforms expand the minister's discretion is the proposed amendments to the national interest exemption. We've already got one in the EPBC Act, but the reform recommended that exemption, the review I should say, recommended that exemption be limited only to national situations of national emergency. I think bushfire situations is probably the easiest one that the review had in mind. The bill proposes to extend these national interest powers that basically exempt certain activities from approvals requirements under the legislation in circumstances that the minister determines to be in the national interest, and that's a really unfettered determination. The minister can also determine that something is a national interest proposal, and that can be based on a whole range of factors which have been specified, some of which have been specified: defence, security, strategic interests, and also, curiously, international agreements. Now, it doesn't say international environmental agreements, so it's conceivable, for example, that it might be considered to be a national interest proposal that we fast track a mine approval for rare earth minerals that would support some bilateral trade agreement with another country. I can easily imagine that sort of falling within that national interest type exemption. So we would strongly recommend that the national interest exemptions be limited to a stipulated set of criteria, and remove this exemption, or at least limit the powers in much clearer terms in the legislation. The bills introduce a new power for the Minister and the CEO of the new EPA to make rulings about how the Act, the regulations or standards should be applied. These rulings could determine that a particular class of activity automatically satisfies the requirements of the legislation. And the concern here is that it's really putting the Minister in the position of the courts, who typically would make decisions about correct legal interpretation of legal provisions. So there's a concern here that there's an overreach on the part of ministerial powers, but also an erosion of the separation of powers. So that reform really either needs to be removed from the package, or at least limited to limit the circumstances in which rulings could be made, procedural matters, or improving environmental protection measures, improving the level of protection or the interpretation that a court might have placed on something to clarify that it was intended to cover a broader range. At the very least, the reforms should stipulate that rulings are judicially reviewable to clarify if the minister's got it wrong. Finally, very briefly, it's less to do with discretion, but the reforms propose a further dilution of the community's power to request reconsideration of the minister's determination that something is not a controlled action and therefore doesn't require approval. This reconsideration power was originally open-ended. It was amended earlier this year before the election to limit reconsideration to 5 years after the original determination was made. It was a response to a request for reconsideration of the decision in relation to Macquarie Harbour's salmon operations. What it means is that even if new evidence shows that an activity is causing significant harm, if 5 years has elapsed, it can't be reassessed. The reforms propose to take that 5-year time limit down to 28 days, which essentially renders that reconsideration power utterly meaningless. It's hard to imagine any situation in which new evidence is going to come to light within 28 days of the minister making their original determination. So there's no scope for the community to sort of reconsider or propose adaptive decision making where serious environmental impacts manifest sometime later. The open-ended timeframe should never have been amended in the first place, but now we're in a situation where we're suggesting that that 5-year limit at the very least be kept, because otherwise we have no scope for revisiting what can be a very, very significant determination by the minister. Back to you, James.
Thank you, Jan. And I think it's fair to say that one of the key concerns that we have is around the level of discretion in the existing Act. And one of the key recommendations out of the Samuel review was to fetter that discretion and put some constraints on it. And what we're seeing is some attempts to try and do that, but then undermined by these broad discretionary arrangements that are being put in place around, for example, the National Environmental Standards and the National Interest Exemption Test that Jan just mentioned. I'm going to go now to a different topic around unacceptable impacts and biodiversity offsets, and introduce Professor Brendan Wintle, who is he's the director of the Melbourne Biodiversity Institute, a lead counsellor with the Biodiversity Council, and is a global leader in conservation and ecology and ecological modelling. So Brendan, I'll throw to you now to talk all things offsets and unacceptable impacts.
Thanks, James, and thanks for having me along. Thanks everyone for joining us. It's a beautiful day here on Wurundjeri country, so I'd just like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples as the traditional owners on the lands on which I'm sitting today. I'd like to start by just talking a little bit about something that could potentially be a really good development under the new bill, which is the introduction of an unacceptable impacts clause into the legislation that really asks the minister to give a quick no to projects that are clearly unacceptable. And the idea of this is that it provides extra clarity for proponents of projects. It allows them to see very clearly the criteria that would mean that they're very unlikely to get an approval under the EPBC Act. And so that's potentially a good development that should provide us with greater certainty for business and greater certainty for the environment. Unfortunately, at the moment, there are some fairly vague definitions around what constitutes unacceptable impact. So at the moment, the wording in the bill says that an unacceptable impact would seriously impair the viability of a species or a threatened ecological community. So there's a fair bit of uncertainty in that language. Seriously impair is a vague concept. Viability is a nice idea in concept. That is that if you institute this project or this measure, it's going to threaten the long-term viability or the medium-term viability of the species, therefore increasing the chance that it would go extinct. Unfortunately, that is a very difficult thing to measure, and it can only ever really be a prediction. And to that extent, it's going to be very hard to interpret. We suggest that if we have this level of vagary in the bill, we're going to see more of these matters go to court. We're going to see a lot of conjecture about whether the unacceptable impacts provision has been properly provided or properly implemented. We would strongly recommend moving to clear and more objective tests. For example, defining unacceptable impacts as any action that would damage or destroy irreplaceable habitat, substantially reduce the abundance of threatened or migratory species, and substantially reduce the extent and condition of a threatened ecological community, and then have a series of thresholds of damage or reduction that cannot be surpassed. And if they are, then they would represent an unacceptable impact. These clear and objective tests and clear and measurable language would be much more valuable both for the environment and for business, so people know where they can stand. We would also like to see a register of essentially irreplaceable habitats, both a list of things that just you cannot damage because it's very, very unlikely that you're ever going to be able to restore or repair that damage. And we would like that to be in the form of a register and ideally mapped. So again, clear guardrails, clear guidelines to business that creates that certainty, but also creates certainty for the environment and starts to stem the tide of loss that we're currently seeing. Unfortunately, the big problem with the current articulation of the unacceptable impacts provision is the same problem that we're seeing throughout this bill, which is that ultimately it just requires ministerial satisfaction. It just requires the minister to be satisfied that there will not be an unacceptable impact. That's not an objective test. That is wriggle room, that's loopholes, that's weasel words. So we've got to get rid of this this ministerial discretion that we're seeing right through the bills. And I think Jan was really articulated very nicely sorts of problems that level of ministerial discretion creates. I'll talk a little bit about the often sticky concept of net gain and offsets. It's a really important part of the new bills. And again, it's a bit of a sort of a set of Jekyll and Hyde things. The first thing to note, and the good thing, is that we're looking to see this principles of net gain, particularly around the avoidance, so the principles of, the mitigation hierarchy around the avoidance where possible of impact, mitigation of impact as a second option, and then finally progressing to offsets only if avoidance and mitigation are shown to be impossible. It's good to have that hierarchy enshrined in the legislation. Unfortunately, the target that's currently articulated is weak. We're just looking at a target of net gain, which can be against a declining baseline. This is really important. What we really need is an absolute gain against a fixed baseline. We would strongly recommend an absolute gain be the objective against the State of the Environment Report, the 2022 State of the Environment Report. That would provide a fixed baseline against which we want to ensure that we're seeing absolute gain of for all matters of national environmental significance. That language could be brought in, made very clear around the definition of what that gain is and how it's measured, and that would again provide us with the certainty that we're seeing a reform package that's actually going to be good for the environment. It's going to start to drive recovery rather than ongoing decline and loss. Very closely associated with this principle of net gain is the offset standard. The offset standard's really only just been released, and so we're still sort of digesting the nuances of that, but the draft offset standard, I should say. It does look like the draft offset standard in its language would require like-for-like offsets. That is, if you damage some leadbeater's possum habitat, you have to repair or restore or use a credit that you've previously obtained for leadbeater's possum habitat. Not that you could replace, you could damage leadbeater's possum habitat and offset it with a bit of grassy woodland somewhere west of the Divide or a bit of land snail habitat in Tasmania. We really need those like-for-like provisions because we're talking about the last of the last for a lot of these species, and we can't keep whittling away at their habitats. It looks like the draft standard would require measured improvements in the matters, and that ideally that the offset would be commenced prior to the impact. So that's a good guard because it means that we know at least that the offset has been identified where it's going to take place and that protection has been instituted before the impact happens. These are good measures. Unfortunately, risks in the current standard are there's no compliance framework. We don't know what the penalties for non-compliance are. And again, there's this declining baseline paradigm, which means that if things are going down like this, then net gain is a slight reduction in that decline, but it's not actually a nature positive outcome. So these are concerning in the current standard. But the big hook, the big problem here is that we have this thing called a restoration contribution fund. And under the current bill, people can choose to either do offsetting according to the standard, or they can pay into a pay to destroy fund, the restoration contribution fund, which then is held by a fund holder, and the fund holder, the government, is then going to actually go and find the offset for the person who's paid into the fund. So as soon as they've paid into that fund, they've acquitted their responsibilities against the offset, which means all the risk about whether that offset will happen, what it will cost, the uncertainty around what that will cost is held by us, the taxpayers. That's not a good outcome. Of course, with this model, you're going to see a lot of people channeling money through this restoration contribution fund, and lo and behold, the fund holder can decide that it doesn't need to achieve like-for-like on any given offset. This is a tragic failing in the design of this scheme. Everybody's going to take this path, and we're going to see continuation of the ongoing decline brought about by this myth of offsets that makes us think that we can have our cake and eat it too, the grand delusion. So we need to actually see if we're going to have offsets under our EPBC Act, they've got to be very clearly defined against a legally enforceable standard and not just a big wishy-washy scheme where a restoration fund holder can essentially decide what they want to do. They could actually decide that they're going to offset the loss of a bit of critically endangered species habitat with some research into maybe that species, maybe something else. This is not acceptable. We need to do away with this kind of discretion. We strongly recommend removing the discretion of the Restoration Contribution Fund holder from this whole package. We also recommend that we have a list of non-offsettable matters maintained. So we really need to know which things just can't be offset, and everybody needs to be able to see that clearly. We would like to see a list of non-offsettable matters actually maintained by a scientifically credible group, such as the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, or another similarly credible, objective, science-based group. We'd like to know that all offsets are going to be like for like, and we'd like to see that very clearly demonstrated. We'd like to know that only matters that have been shown to be offsettable, that is, you can actually restore a particular matter, a particular species or a threatened ecological community, only those things can be offset. That would require the maintenance of a register of things that can be offset. And that clear specificity will help us all trust that there's some scientific evidence behind the proposition to offset a particular type of ecosystem. And we'd like to see that as a public register. We would also like to see a public register of the outcomes of offsets. So where have offsets been approved? Where has the offset actually been implemented? And what's the outcome according to the monitoring of that offset? And that would require us to have very strict rules about how those offset outcomes should be measured and at what frequency and regularity and those sorts of things. We really need to see that level of detail in the standards so that we can actually be assured that offsets are going to bring about an overall gain, not ongoing decline. James, I'm on a bit of a rant here. Maybe I should throw back to you and save us a little bit of time. I think I've probably covered off on the main points.
No, it wasn't a rant at all. It was excellent, and it kind of gets to the nub of some of the core concerns and issues that we have with the legislation as it stands. And where we've seen these pay to destroy schemes operate at state and territory level, they've failed. New South Wales, very well documented. Actually, the New South Wales government is now committed to looking at other approaches and constraining the amount of funds it puts in to its pay to play offsets arrangements. One other point just worth noting for those on the call is also that the government's included this top-up provision into the legislation, and the top-up provision enables the taxpayer to put into the Restoration Contributions Fund where the government hasn't collected sufficient funds from a proponent to meet an offset liability. And so there's kind of two ways that the government's going to be able to, the Restoration Contributions holder is going to be able to operate where there is a real constraint on the delivery of offsets. One will be it can relax like-for-like provisions, or the other approach could be to get the taxpayer to put in. And when you think about it, that taxpayer will be picking up what should be a private liability for a very well-off property or mining or other developer. So there are some, very serious concerns around some of those offset arrangements.
James, could I also just add one other, I guess, that we need to be very alive to, and that is that we need to make sure that generic nature repair market certificates cannot be used to offset the damage to matters of national environmental significance. That's an assurance that we currently have under the nature repair market legislation, I believe, that we've heard could be relaxed under new arrangements. We need to really be alive to that possibility, because that essentially removes any meaningful like-for-like constraints, and it would certainly undermine the nature repair market, which would move it from being a positive market to essentially an offsets market, a market that essentially facilitates damage.
Yeah, excellent point. Thank you, Brendan. I'd like to now go to Liz Ashby, who is the Policy and Innovation Lead at the Biodiversity Council. And Liz has a really strong background in public policy and government, having worked for 15 years in the Victorian and federal environment departments before joining the Biodiversity Council in a really in a legislative reform and strategic policy space. So Liz, we're going to talk to you about Environment Information Australia data and transparency. Do you want to kick us off there?
Thanks, James. Yes, so it's a bit of a change of pace. I just want to first acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land I'm calling it from today, which is Naarm, Melbourne. I think it's interesting in terms of the promise of Environment Information Australia and what people's expectations were about what it might deliver compared to what's in the legislation. So, of course, there's been this strong sense that if we could collect data better and better publicly report on it, then there will be a better basis for regulation and public policy and understanding of environmental issues. And Environment Information Australia was a theme within the Samuel Review. So it's positive to see that under the reforms, the government is proposing to establish Environment Information Australia and have one of their functions be the maintenance of environmental economic accounts and to prepare state of environment reports every 2 years. I guess one of the key things to note, though, is that, for instance, the 2021 State of the Environment Report was prepared by a group of scientists, but under the legislative reform, the State of Environment Report will be prepared by the head of Environment Information Australia, who will be an executive within the Federal Environment Department. And so you're moving from a system where scientists could seek input from government, and they acknowledge where governments are providing input into SOE reporting, to one where the Environment Department can seek input from scientists. And so in theory, and what it says legislatively, I guess, is the head is not subject to the direction of the Secretary of the Department or the Minister in performing their functions, but it's unclear if there'll be political pressure to do certain things in terms of state of environment reporting in practice. I guess one of the other challenges with the state of environment reporting is that it explicitly talks about the job of reporting on trends in the environment, and also in progress in meeting national environmental goals. They're defined by the Minister. And something that the Biodiversity Council has been concerned about is our progress in meeting our commitment under the Global Biodiversity Framework. So we have previously provided feedback related to Australia's strategy for nature, which is Australia's plan about how it is intending to meet the Global Biodiversity Framework goals. And we have been concerned about that strategy has had a lack of urgency and ambition, and it hasn't set really clear paths for how these targets that it sets related to the Global Biodiversity Framework will be realised in practice. There's a lot of suggestion that it's everyone's responsibility to contribute to these, and that's not really a recipe for success in actually delivering. And so we think that, for instance, the provisions related to state of environment reporting should more explicitly state that there should be reporting on Australia's progress in meeting international commitments and implementing its national strategy and action plan that sits under the Convention on Biological Diversity. Another element of the Environment Information Australia bill is related to its sharing of data. And so the Samuel Review really set a goal for the EIA of establishing this, clear, accessible, authoritative source of environmental data and information. And the review rejected claims that EIA data, data collected by proponents under environmental impact assessment, as opposed to Environment Information Australia, that data they're collecting for their projects should be treated as commercial in confidence, because Samuel Review emphasised that this environmental data is in the public good. But the way that the reforms are written is really the reverse of this. And so it really prioritises information confidentiality. And so what you see is that the head of Information Australia is able to share data with certain groups and for certain purposes, but they're quite constrained. So the head of Environment Information Australia is allowed to share data with Commonwealth agencies and law enforcement, and if there's a serious risk to human health or the environment. They're also able to share with state and territory agencies, but only where there's an agreement and only where that data sharing complies with that agreement. And so what we're saying is not only is this not this broad sort of publicly accessible data, but we're not even seeing that they're able to share it with research institutions. And so that really limits our ability to understand patterns in environmental approvals, what's going right, what's going wrong, where should we move the system to improve environmental outcomes. And it is interesting because these provisions related to confidentiality seemingly have a definition that should be able to protect the data sufficiently without sort of circumscribing who it can be provided to. So there's this definition related to protected information that covers factors such as, information that's confidential or that would say compromise a compliance activity or compromise environmental assessment. And so you think that it could be drafted such that the information can be broadly shared provided it isn't protected information, but that's not what's happening. It really is very limited who the data can be shared with. In terms of shifting away from Environment Information Australia, I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of the provisions related to sort of devolution of approvals to the states and territories. So for a long time, there's been this discussion about whether assessments and approvals could move from Commonwealth responsibility and to the states and territories. So there's been these bilateral agreements between the Commonwealth and different states that allow assessments to be undertaken under state and territory legislation. But these reforms are really about whether the decision makers at a state and territory level can approve those. So instead of it being the Minister for Environment at federal level, whether it might be a state minister for environment or a state minister for planning or an executive within an agency at that state level. And I guess one of the concerns with this is it's removing this sort of critical safeguard that's really about protecting biodiversity that are sort of recognised nationally as important and that are protected under these international agreements. And so there's been these previous bills that have proposed this, but they've never passed the Senate. And the EDO has done a number of analyses over time to show that there's limited assurances that environmental outcomes will be delivered under this devolved responsibilities. So there's a lot of variation in state-based regulation, and a lot of it isn't actually fit for purpose to regulate impacts on matters of national environmental significance. So as mentioned, in certain states and territories, some of the projects aren't regulated specifically by a Biodiversity Act. They might be happening under a planning system that might have a carve-out that says that the biodiversity legislation might not apply, and so on. And the thing is that it isn't actually necessary if your objective is to streamline approvals. If you're saying that it takes too long, it's slowing projects down, there are other mechanisms that are available within the EPBC Act to do that. So we can do streamlined assessments, we can do strategic assessments, and actually if we develop really robust national environmental standards and really clear definitions of unacceptable impacts, that provides that really clear benchmark for these assessments and really clear whether something will be approved. And so one of the challenges, I guess, to understand is if you're operating as a public servant, writing briefs and making recommendations around assessment and approval of individual projects, and there's all this discretion and ambiguity about what projects are acceptable and what conditions should be put on projects, that actually wastes a lot of time, to be honest. If there's actually a clearer, more objective test, then it's much easier as a public servant who's making recommendations to an environment minister to say, yes, it does meet the test and should be approved, or no, it doesn't. And so actually setting up a system as Samuel intended in the Samuel review would actually make things more streamlined, efficient, because that was one of his objectives. But instead, we're doing these mechanisms that actually cast doubt on whether we're going to actually achieve the environmental outcomes that we need.
Thanks, Liz.
I'll throw it back to you, James.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and that's a really good point. And for my sins, I've been an administrator of the EPBC Act in my younger years, and it is quite clear to see the efficiencies in that, and not through handing decision-making powers to the states, because that actually won't matter much. It's in around how we align and coordinate the assessment and information requirements with states and territories in the Commonwealth. And that is where, truthfully, as someone who's worked on the inside, for those, and I'm sure there are public servants on this call as well, that is where the efficiency grady is made. Getting that part right, and you can still have concurrent decision making and accountability at both state and federal levels. We're about to go to Q&A, but I think there's a couple of points that we just want to touch on still. One of those is the Samuel Review made note of the requirement to account for emissions in environmental impact assessment. And for those who are following the news, you'll have recently seen that the UN has joined a landmark case in Australia on the emissions impacts of a major project. It is a glaring hole. We have some glaring holes in our national environmental law, accounting for emissions in 2025 in an era of severe climate damage is one of them. Having huge loopholes that don't allow threatened species law to be applied to native forest logging operations is another. And so it's going to be really important that these laws address the industry carve-outs, as Jan mentioned, and also take account of the major threats that are impacting people, places, wildlife in Australia. We've got 4 mega drivers of biodiversity decline, habitat destruction, invasive species, fire, and climate damage. They're well understood in Australia. And if we are to turn the trajectory around on those mega drivers, we need laws that are capable of dealing with them. And it's not just laws, it's also going to be investments. And I wish I could have your attention for another hour and we could talk about the need to better fund biodiversity, but this one's very much focused on legislative reform. So we'll stick with there. There's some excellent questions. So thank you all for sticking around. We've got 440 people. It's fantastic. I'm glad you're all as engaged on environmental law reform. But I saw one that has just been upvoted massively, and I'm just going to try and find it because it is one that we've grappled with in the council and actually across colleagues, which is from Tracy Rout. So do members of the panel think the proposed legislation, as it now stands, is an improvement on the current Act or a step backwards? And I'm gonna take the MC's, the privilege to give my response on that first, because we've grappled with this, and the best answer we came up with is it's a Hobson's choice. It isn't really a choice. I likened it to as a millennial, I likened it to a South Park episode for those who watch South Park in my youth. But we're forced to choose between 2 suboptimal options, and at the moment they're both not great. Hey, and that's the real problem. And there is a bit of brinkmanship that's going on in the politics, and we can talk to the politics because it's right in the media today. But from my perspective and from the council's perspective, we really want to see this strengthened. And if it passes as it currently stands without any strengthening, it's very hard to see it delivering material gains for biodiversity. I think there's a lot in it for industry. I don't see much in it for biodiversity. And I think we continue on the same trajectory we are currently on. And I think in 5 years' time, the people who are championing this thing as being a great outcome for nature are going to be licking their wounds. But I might throw to Brendan on that one.
Thanks, James. I did pop a text response to Tracy in the chat. Good question. I just nuanced James's answer a little bit to say, and I think I said this to Senator Dunniam the other day in the hearing. There are good structures in this bill. So yes, standards, and we need to make sure that standards are actually required. At the moment, it seems to be at the discretion of the minister, but let's assume we actually get standards that are outcomes based. So we're starting to see these structures emerge. I think the an EPA, yes, great, but at the moment, is it independent? No, not really. Unacceptable impacts clauses, a quick no, great idea, but at the moment it's vague and it's too much at the discretion of the minister as well. It's just the minister has to be satisfied. So I guess what I would say is the structures are there for this to be a good a step forward, a good step forward for the EPBC Act, but there's so much uncertainty in the way that it's been set up, so much discretion and that uncertainty is in itself a big step backwards. And there are things that could get worse rather than better if it goes through as it's currently worded. So it's a sort of a caveated answer that it's currently, I would say, worse as it's written because there's so much discretion and we know that's going to bring us unstuck eventually. But I would say there are good structures in there that we should be encouraging, like this articulation of unacceptable impacts, an early no, the mandating of the standards, the penalties for breaking the law look like they might actually be increased. That's a good thing. That's been long overdue. The fact that companies could just pay this pathetic little fine for doing something catastrophic to nature or culture has been a huge problem so far. So, increasing those penalties is a good step. But yeah, on net, too much discretion.
Thanks, Brendan. Jan, Tegan, Liz?
I agree. I think that the provisions relating to offsets are really concerning, and particularly the pay to destroy restoration payments. I'm really concerned about that. I'm concerned about the link to the nature repair market. It was specifically excluded, and now this is the way in which they're bringing it back in. The potential for devolution of not just assessment processes, but approvals to states will really fundamentally undermine the role of the Commonwealth if the Commonwealth chooses to go down that path. And that's the problem. As Brendan said, as you've said, we can't just cross our fingers and hope that the minister of the day implements this legislation in good faith. We need to make sure that the legislation can only be implemented in good faith. The legislation itself has to have that strengthening in it. So at the moment, I would say that on balance, there are so many loopholes, so many new possibilities in this one that it's actually worse than what we've currently got. The potential is for it to be much worse.
Unless Tegan or Liz, do you have any?
I think, I agree with what everyone else has said. And I think from an Indigenous perspective, there is no real meaningful change in this legislation. I mean, I spoke to some of those positive elements, but in fact, they're happening anyway. It's just putting them into legislation. And so I think, will we see meaningful change on the ground for Indigenous groups managing large pieces of the conservation estate? Very unlikely in this reform process.
I would agree with everything that's been said, and I think one of the challenges for us is that by leaving everything to discretion, you're going to have to put your trust in the minister and the department. And unfortunately, if we go based on the narrative that has been made in public, they're not speaking to enhancing environmental protections at all. It's very much a narrative around the environment being a barrier to development that's necessary. And so even if there are instruments or if there's, guidelines that follow or policies, or there are, calculators, restoration contributions, or the holder can choose to vary like for like, or the head of Environment Information Australia determines what's in the report. It's difficult to have a lot of faith that it's going to go in a positive direction given the narrative around that.
Yeah, definitely. So just moving on, and I might just take this question on because there's been a question on process. So Peter Moriartis writes, at present the bill was presented to Parliament next week, and if the government was presented to Parliament next week, and if the government has its way, voted on, passed in the next 2 weeks. I'm not going to read the full length of the questions, but I'll just get to the last. Won't all these incredibly helpful proposals for improvement mean nothing if the bill is voted on next week or the following week? Well, it's next week, because next week is the last sitting week of the calendar year. And I would say that this has been a long journey in terms of the overall environmental law reform. Under Tanya Plibersek, there was a series of lock-ins or budget-style lock-ups, which was very unusual in its own right, and many of us participated in those. This time around, it's a new minister, it's a new term of government, so it's similar as the same Prime Minister. But the way this was developed, again, was very unusual. The government went off, there was no public consultation. A lot of the stuff was building on the lockups. So again, even that wasn't publicly consulted on. There were some small groups that were consulted on throughout that process. The Biodiversity Council wasn't necessarily part of those small groups, although we did try and meet with the Minister's Office and the department to discuss this. But really, this is a bad process. This needed to go through a proper public ventilation for 1,500 pages of legislation to be introduced with 3 weeks of debate. Now, there's a Senate inquiry that goes through to March next year. But as you point out, Peter, the bills might get passed next week. And it's this is the political theatre and brinkmanship of it all. We gave evidence to the Senate inquiry, and there's a Senate inquiry on this very second in Parliament House. Even though the submissions to the Senate inquiry aren't due until early December. So again, just unusual process. And it's politics. It's the theatre of politics. It's Labor using, a deadline to force a negotiation and to try and force a deal with either the coalition, which would certainly be the preference of people like, as Jim Chalmers the Treasurer came out yesterday and said that's his preferred pathway. Or to try and force a conversation with the Greens and a negotiation and deal with the Greens. And look, it's all happening. They're talking as we speak. If you want to be involved in this, put pressure on your local MP, no matter where they are, to make sure that it is done better and it is strengthened. We are, of course, talking in Canberra to various political parties and people around what a potential negotiating position could look like. But even we're scrambling to get our heads around 1,500 pages of legislation on top of more than 1,000 pages of existing legislation.
Plus new standards
plus new standards. So just the message I'd leave you with, this is a bad way of doing things, a bad way of engaging with the public. I'd say it was unexpected for a Labor government to do this, but it's becoming par for the course. The government's becoming more restrictive in the way it discloses information. It's having battles on FOI. So this is starting to become a new norm, which I think in modern democracies we should be a little bit concerned about. Jan, you look like you were about to say something. Oh, no, you're all good. So moving on from that, Brendan?
Just there's a pretty highly voted question here, James, which is it possible to provide an overview table with improvements from the 2020 review, the EPBC Act? So I guess I would say we've got our fact sheet that sets out what we think's wrong with the current proposition and how we think that should be improved. There are various tables out there that compare current to proposed. I don't know about whether we will have the bandwidth to go back to the 2020 review and talk about what's been adopted and not adopted in the current bills. I think we could probably give some high level examples of things, and I guess we would just keep coming back to the statement of the review, which is standards must be clear and enforceable, set clear and enforceable outcomes. At the moment, we would say it's hard to see these being enforceable, given the amount of wriggle room that's in there. But yeah, I wonder if there's any other sort of high level recommendations from the review that we wanted to sort of briefly touch on for Frederick.
Well, is that an open question, for others?
If we have time, I suppose.
Oh, well, I think from the Samuel review itself, Jen, if there's anything on top of your mind?
That are things, sorry, things that are significant departures from the recommendations. I mean, is that what you're asking?
I think that's it.
Well, the first thing is that the review recommended that the highest priority should be that forestry be immediately brought within the operation of the EPBC Act. His view was that the oversight and the operation of the regional forest agreement process was not working, that forestry in Australia was having a devastating impact on our listed species, and that the Commonwealth needed to assume or resume some kind of oversight. That clearly isn't even remotely on the agenda. That's an obvious one that I would say.
I think that the reduction of discretion, ministerial discretion, is the obvious one. That was the sort of most clear criticism. That I know that the review did talk about the experienced failure of offsets to actually deliver good or positive outcomes for nature, and that's, you know, that's funny in the current setup. It looks like there are some good things in the offset standard, but all of that can just be waved away by a restoration fund holder or the minister, and that's clearly, you know, leaves us no better off than where we currently are. So, you know, that's probably one of the other ones that I see as being particularly weak.
Yeah, can I add one point to that, which speaks to one of the questions that's in the chat at the moment, or in the Q&A at the moment, and that's to do with the mitigation hierarchy. Samuel, the review was critical of the fact that the mitigation hierarchy was a ticker box, that there was no process for really meaningfully requiring it, and therefore offsets were regarded as a way of doing business. At the moment, the mitigation hierarchy doesn't appear at all in the draft offset standard. It appears in the draft National Environmental Standard for matters of national environmental significance. But one of the things that's striking about the way in which it's put there is the two things, really. One is that everything is should, not must. So there we've got that discretion again, that there may be circumstances where you should, but don't have to. But the other thing is that the way it's framed at the moment, it's in passive voice. So it's really unclear whether it's the responsibility of the decision maker to ensure that that happens, or whether it's just something that the proponent needs to do. And so again, it gives us no confidence that the mitigation hierarchy, that recommendation of the review relating to the mitigation hierarchy, is going to be meaningfully implemented.
Thanks, Jen. And I was just about to go to that question, and there's another related question, which also similarly highly voted. And thank you, Rosie, for the question on the mitigation hierarchy. But, you know, what safeguards will ensure, and this is a question from Amanda, what safeguards ensure offsets result in net environmental gain, not merely no net loss? And will it prevent historical failures where offset sites end up in worse condition? Maybe Brendan, if you want to take that one first up.
Yeah, look, I guess I did start to put some comments in there. I mean, first of all, we just need a really clear objective that it's an absolute gain that needs to be articulated. I mean, I would like to see that actually articulated in the actual legislation, that the objective of the legislation is to see an absolute gain against a fixed baseline, not this slippery net gain concept that can actually mean ongoing decline, but just doing a bit, you know, a slightly less steep decline than what we've been witnessing already. So I would say, you know, really clear objective around an absolute gain, I think, is the first and most important thing to set that up. we've got to totally get avoided loss offsets off the. You can't just draw a line around a bit of existing habitat that's not even, may or may not be under threat, call that an avoided loss, and then use that to justify or to compensate for the liquidation of endangered species habitats. That's crazy. We can't be just allowing offsets to be approved for things where nobody has ever documented the actual successful restoration and achievement of an offset for that kind of environment, that habitat, that ecological community. So we've basically got to stop offsetting things that just can't actually ever be offset or compensated for. Those things just need to be put in a basket of, you can't destroy this, unless we've got a national interest, like it's a war and we've got to run a highway straight up to Cape York. I mean, that sort of stuff. Just we just can't keep chipping away at these things that are on the way down. And we've got to have decent costs applied to offsets. At the moment, it's just for the places where we are allowing people to pay into a fund, it's been clearly reported we're just not charging anything like what we'd need to charge to compensate that matter. Sometimes that you just can't find the offset, and then the holder's holding some money that's not nearly enough to actually compensate. So those sorts of things need to be sorted out as well. I really honestly believe a register of non-offsettable matters is a really important and basic requirement. That is, people need to be able to know where they're talking about a type of habitat or a type of environment that you're just not going to be able to find an offset for, and we just have to be a lot more honest about that. There's a couple of things anyway.
Thanks, Brendan. I'm going to put a pin in the questions there because we're a few minutes away from time. So thank you all for dialing in. For the panel, I guess if there's any final words that anyone would like to say, but I'll just leave you with one question, which is, if the bulldozers were at the gates of a really important place, let's say Kakadu, do you think Anthony Albanese would scramble the RAAF to send the jets like what Bob Hawke did in 1983-84? Because that's what happened. It feels like we're not where we were back then, and Labor has to find its environmental ambition again. That's what it feels like to me, at least. But take any thoughts from the panel as a closing comment.
Well, I'm happy to say, James, that I feel like in terms of the once in a generation opportunity to fix our environmental laws and actually bring about genuine protection for the environment that is demonstrably declining. I mean, I don't want to start diving back into SOE statistics, but the State of the Environment report paints a very, very dire picture. If this is their once in a generation attempt to fix that problem, then limp is probably the best adjective I would apply there. It's really not even close. We've really got to find that ambition for the environment again. And, with a government with such a strong mandate to do this properly and a pretty damn healthy margin, I cannot see why this bill looks like it was written by the Minerals Council.
Well put. Hard to top that one. Liz?
I just also add with this that it's sort of strange that all this work goes into the Samuels Review. There's so much consultation, and then we have these lockups, and it's like the process is getting progressively worse through time, so that there's even problems where people pick up with drafting or where things seem to be all thought through and details to come. And the Federal Environment Minister can't answer sort of certain questions when they're put to him about how it operates. So it's really, you touched on it not being a very good process in terms of public consultation, but it also isn't a very good process in terms of actually, I think, policy rigor and working through the problems. And I think that also goes to the narrative that the Treasurer has or the Prime Minister has. I don't really think that they really get it, to be honest with you. And so there's a big question there. And I think that when we've seen gains in the past, there's been environment ministers of different stripes, different political stripes, but they've been people who've been passionate about the environment, and then they've pushed for change, and we're sort of, guess, waiting for a federal environment champion to really, shift the dial.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. Thank you, the 355 people who stuck with us. We got almost to 500 during this call, which is great that everyone's so interested. Have a fantastic weekend. Thank you, panelists. Yep, keep your eye on things from the Biodiversity Council. And if you are so inclined, reach out to the Environment Minister, reach out to the Prime Minister, tell them to do better. This is a live issue. Thanks very much.